Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, we're starting a whole new topic. This is the 8th topic of the course. And this topic is titled Christianity and Islam, the Imperial Faiths. So, as the title suggests, in this particular topic, we're going to be looking at world religions, the emergence of world religions, specifically in the Mediterranean basin, in the Near East, what is called Mesopotamia, or the Middle East. And what we're going to see is that in this region of the world, which includes not only the Mediterranean basin, but also Western Europe as well, we're going to see the flourishing of monotheistic religions that pretty much dominated the entire millennium from, let us just say, the beginning of the contemporary era. Again, that really marks the beginning of the Christian era as well. Let's just say the year 1 in our Western calendar, all the way to the end of that millennium, and we can actually push that date, of course, much later, of course. But for the entire millennium, the Mediterranean basin, Western Europe, including Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, is going to be dominated by the rise of new faiths that were monotheistic, that is to say that they were centered on the belief of one God. And those were faiths that in their own way offer a moral code, a system of ethics, ethical behavior for people to follow in order to attain salvation. The promise of those religions was really the idea that after death, the souls, the essence of human beings, were going to either face reward in a heaven for their good deeds on earth, or they were going to face punishment in hell again. Again, those were in very general ways the structural framework of those two faiths. They're going to be coming out of Mesopotamia. Both of those religions really came out of the Middle East, yet one flourished in Europe and in the Mediterranean basin, that is Christianity, while the other, Islam, is going to, for the most part, expand and have great successes in converting people in the Middle East, although Islam is also going to expand into places like North Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, and as we'll see, is also going to capture some regions of Western Europe, particularly the Iberian Peninsula as well. And of course, there's going to be a clash between those two world religions. And as we'll see, those two world religions are going to a certain degree, dominate, if you will, world history, particularly in the regions that we already described. And they're going to serve as great civilizing agents as well. So instead of looking at civilizations, the way we have been doing that in the past, when we look at China or India, for example, or Mesoamerica, Egypt, and so on, in this topic, we're going to see how world religions served as agents of civilization as well, bringing peoples together, creating a common identity, if you will, and serving to a certain degree as the foundation for the rise of imperial systems as well. So those religions, as we'll see, are not just going to remain, just systems of thought or belief systems, but rather they're going to serve as the basis, as the foundation for state systems, particularly empires. And those empires are going to be legitimized by those religions. And at the same time, those empires are going to try to expand those faiths as well into new regions and new territories of the world. Okay, so let us go to our slide to see how we're going to approach this topic. Christianity and Islam, the imperial faiths, and the table of contents, what it shows is that first and foremost, there's going to be a brief introduction to the topic on religion, why religion is significant to look at and study it, and particularly what were some of the functions that religion played, if you will, in this region of the world. Again, this is something just to, again, as a kind of a general introduction to this topic, because this is going to deal very heavily, again, with religious ideas, religious beliefs, religious teachings and principles. This is the part of the course that is going to focus, for the most part, on religion. Now, the way we're going to approach this topic, Christianity and Islam, is that first, the first part is going to look at the Mesopotamian worldview, some of the religious expressions, religious systems of Mesopotamia that really served as the foundation for both Christianity and Islam. In this case, the religion of Judaism, in this case, the prophet Abraham, how he's going to be influential in the formation of both Christianity and Islam, of course, much, much later, but also Zoroastrianism as well. The Zoroastrian religion of ancient Persia is also going to be foundational for the rise of Christianity and Islam. Again, so Christianity and Islam, despite the fact that those are two different and distinct systems of thought and belief and faith, they share at the very core, their very foundation, identical ideas. Okay, and those ideas came out from, again, the prophet Abraham, and also from Zoroaster, the prophet that gave rise to the Zoroastrian religion. Once we establish that, again, because this is fundamental to understand, again, Christianity and Islam, then we move into part two. And part two is going to look at Christianity, how it started out as a Jewish sect, centered on the figure, of course, of Jesus. He was the prophet, if you will, that established one of the basic principles and teachings of this faith, and how it started spreading, first in the Middle East, and then it moved into the Eastern Mediterranean, places like Greece, and then, as we'll see, how it entered the heart of the Roman Empire, and from there it started spreading across the Roman Empire to the point that by the year 325 AD, Christianity becomes now the official religion of the Roman state. Again, the Imperial Religion again. So we're going to look at that very closely in part two. Once we establish that, then we move into part three. Now we shift now to the Middle East proper, and we see the rise of Islam here, how it started out as a movement by the Prophet Muhammad. Again, there's going to be another figure here emerging in the Arabian Peninsula. Again, in this region that was inhabited by a number of different nomadic tribal groups that were pastoralists, and how this movement that started out by Muhammad, again, that incorporated different tribal groups, pastoralists, again, groups, how they moved from the pastoral sects to become really the religion of the empires formed by the caliphs. The caliphs were really the religious communities that flourished in the Middle East, that carry on the message of the Prophet Muhammad again, and those communities called the caliphs, those religious communities that were guided in many cases by religious figures or political figures, created imperial systems in which Islam, once again, provided the legitimacy for those imperial societies, for those imperial orders. Okay, we're going to get to see that very closely as well. Now, at the very end, part 4 is going to look at the clash of the imperial faiths, the interaction between Christianity and Islam, produce a series of conflicts otherwise known as the Crusades. We're going to get to see as well in the very end, again, the so-called Crusades, and that was really the clash of those two world religions. All right, so now let us look into the first and foremost the general introduction, to the topic of religion. Particularly, we're seeing here the functions of religion in the ancient world. Okay, first and foremost, again, we have to understand first and foremost the different roles that religion played for ancient societies. And this is something that I have explained ever since the very beginning of the course, that when we look at ancient societies, ancient history, religion was not something that people carried out on the periphery of their lives. Religion was central and fundamental to people's lives, to people's cultures, to people's communities and societies. Their entire world was based on religion. Now, because in the ancient world, what we call today science had not yet been developed. Okay, so if people wanted to explain how things work, the way nature works, for example, religion provided, quote unquote, answers to people's questions as to, what makes the world work, why, the sun and the moon revolve around the earth and so on, why, there's rain and why there are earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, etc. For those kinds of so-called scientific questions, religion was used, or people use religion in order to provide an answer to that. And often, again, the answers were something along the lines of, there are divine beings, divine forces, gods and goddesses in nature that are actually, moving everything all around us. The world moves, the world works because there are divine forces, spirits, and so on that are actually making it work, in other words, okay? Including philosophical questions. People since the very beginning of time have asked questions about, for example, why there's death. Why do we die, for example? Okay, what is the meaning of human existence, and so on. Those kinds of philosophical questions were also, for the most part, addressed by religious explanations as well. We are living in this world because the God made us. The gods of creation molded humans, put them on earth in order to serve the God, for example. This is the meaning of human existence. That's just one of the answers that people crafted or formulated in the ancient world, always using religious explanations, the gods and so on, or the ancestor spirits and so on, as to be the ones responsible for creating humans, putting humans on earth in order to carry out certain purposes, again, or designs and so on. But in the ancient world, religion also served other purposes as well that were also central to the construction of communities and also state systems. When humans, early humans, back in, let us just say in the Neolithic age, when we see the rise of villages and so on, and sedentary communities and societies, early farming practices, for example, when we see the emergence of political institutions and chiefs and so on, what we see is that religion served a critical role in providing legitimacy to those in power, to the ruling institutions, for example. And ever since that time, the construction of villages and sedentary communities, all the way to, let us just say, the rise of city-states and kingdoms and, of course, and empires. Religion has been very, very useful for maintaining political order, because it was very difficult for rulers in the ancient world to control human behavior, to control people, in other words, through the sheer use of physical force. It's too difficult to control people by simply saying, look, we need to maintain political order, so we're going to increase the number of troops and armed forces and so on in order to maintain control. It is just too difficult and too time consuming. So to a certain degree, religion served the purpose of convincing people that it was necessary for them to behave appropriately and to obey the laws of the state, to obey the chief, to obey the ruler, whatever, king and emperor and so on, because the gods had established society in this way. So it was necessary to obey the ruler, because by doing that, we were at the same time obeying the gods. And disobedience will incur divine punishment. Okay? So again, religion was very, very useful, because this was a very subtle way of convincing people that it was in their best interest to behave appropriately and to stay in their place, in other words, okay, to maintain political order. You don't have to use sheer force to control human behavior, because religion is going to substitute sheer force for, let us just say, a system of beliefs that convinces people that this is necessary, okay? Fearing punishment in the afterlife, or fearing the divine wrath of the gods by breaking the law, and so on and so forth. Again, so political order, again, is one of the functions of religion in the ancient world. In the ancient world, religion also played other kinds of roles, and that is, it allowed the formation of communities as well. That's what it was called community building. Particularly communities that were composed of diverse ethnic, linguistic, cultural populations. We're talking about, for example, now larger communities, kingdoms, or empires that embrace a multiplicity of different groups that really don't share much in common. So how do you actually bring people from different backgrounds together so they can see themselves connected as one people? Well, religion also plays the role in that regard, because it builds networks. Religion, when people share the same beliefs, they share the same gods, they partake on the same ceremonies, despite the fact that they're coming from different backgrounds, that creates a sense of community. Okay? People now form the idea that they are a community of believers that are connected through religious ties, that the gods that they worship are the gods of creation that have created the kingdom, they have created the community, and it is important to come together because this is the will of the gods. Okay? So religion also serves as a source of identity. Whenever kinship failed, okay, whenever people saw themselves living with other peoples that had no relationships with, different family groups, different king groups, and so on, well, religion supplanted what is called kinship or tribal identification and was able to glue, if you will, different king groups, different tribal groups together under one common identity, providing what is called social cohesion, okay, in the ancient world. And this is something that we're going to get to see, particularly with the rise of Christianity and Islam, particularly. They're going to become universal or world religions because those religions transcended, in many cases, tribal or ethnic affiliations, incorporating a wide array of so many different groups under one faith, okay, under one faith. So it allows the formation of communities, larger communities. In the ancient world, religion also served another very important function in that it also presented through either the teachings of a prophet or the teachings of a sage, for example, a mystic, and so on, really an ethical code for people to follow in order to behave in a very civilized way. Okay, to behave in a very civilized way. Because remember, in the ancient world, humans behaved radically different from the ways, let us just say, people behave today. There's been change, despite the fact that we might perhaps even question that even today. There has been change, that have taken place, since the ancient world, in that humans, let us just say thousands of years ago, just didn't have too much control of their emotions, their urges, or their thought patterns. They just couldn't control very much those emotions. Whenever they felt wrath or anger or rage, they will act upon it, and they will not even question or stop, and observe, how they were feeling and try to question that and trying to behave in a more rational way, for example. There were not a lot of introspection and self-reflection, let it just say, in the past. So people were very impulsive. They will act upon their emotions, and that often ended, of course, in violence, what we call barbarism today, okay? Barbaric behavior. So religion, particularly the religions that we're going to be looking at in this topic, Christianity and Islam, this is not to say those were the only ones, of course, we have looked at in the past. For example, we looked at Buddhism in India. We looked at Jainism also in India. Vedanta, we looked at that, how those mystical religions also offered an ethical code for behavior, for people to retreat from the world and try to seek, for example, inner peace, to awaken the better angels of themselves, in other words. We looked at that, the noble truths of Buddhism and so on, compassion, nonviolence, and the like, trying to transform the barbaric impulses of human beings into a more noble, if you will, nature. Trying to awaken the noble nature of human beings. So religion served that purpose in the ancient world, providing models for human behavior. Whether we're talking about Buddha or Mahavira, for example, in India, or the mystics of the forest in India, or we're talking about, for example, sages or enlightened beings or prophets and the like, those religions offer models for human behavior. Of course, in the ancient world, we see a change or transition stage, let it just say, from the heroic, let it just say, age of ancient civilizations, in which, for the most part, what we see is that during the heroic ages of ancient Greece, for example, or Mesopotamia or Rome, the models for human behavior that was offered to people through their mythologies and religions was really a model for the ideal warrior and the ideal king. The heroic demigods, those were actually human beings that took on certain divine qualities, and they served as model for human behavior. Again, this is in the heroic age, going back in time. For example, in Mesopotamia, Gilgamesh, this enlightened king, this philosopher king that underwent a transformation from being a very cruel, very unruly, uncaring king to be an enlightened king, caring for his people and trying to be a model for his own subjects, for example. Among the Greeks, Dionysius and Achilles were considered to be the models for human behavior for the Greeks of antiquity. Those were demigods, the ideal warrior, again, that was, like Achilles, for example, that will conquer his enemies almost single-handedly and so on. That was really how men were supposed to fight, imitate Achilles and so on. And Dionysius, again, is a kind of savior as well, creating a kind of savior religion among the Greeks as well. Among the Romans, Hercules and Romulus are going to be the kind of demigods that people emulated in ancient times, in ancient Rome. And those serve as models for human behavior. Now, with the rise of the classical civilizations, we looked at that when we looked, for example, in India, the classical age of India that gave us all the enlightened sages, for example, the new religions like Buddhism and Jainism, for example, yoga, Vedanta, for example. In ancient Greece, we see the rise of Socrates, the rise of Plato, introducing, of course, now new models, new modes of thought for human behavior. For example, virtue and wisdom, selfless love, selfless care for others, for example, and wisdom as well. In other words, the kind of understanding that enables people to distinguish between what is good for the whole and what is also bad or detrimental for human societies as well. To the pursuit of the common good, in other words, the selfless individual that is serving others in order to improve their lives and help them also attain peace and attain enlightenment as well. I mean, this is really something that emerged, roughly speaking, about 700 BC, the classical teachings that gave us, the world religions, for example, the teachings, for example, of Buddha and Mahavira in India. In Egypt, we have also enlightened sages such as Thoth and Pathotep as well. And in China, we see Lao Tse and Confucius. We looked at that when we looked at China as well. The Tao, for example, Lao Tse presenting the Tao, the flow of the universe, trying to go with the harmony of nature and so on and so forth. A peaceful existence, inner peace and the like. And Confucius, again, trying to create an orderly society by obeying our elders and paying homage to our ancestors and pretty much do good to all society as well. Be compassionate and the like. Those were by no means the only ones. I mentioned also that in ancient Greece, we see the rise of Socrates and Plato trying to offer, once again, new system of ethics based on justice, again, and wisdom, social justice, do no harm to others, trying to create the ideal society, the ideal city that is governed by philosopher kings that will be governing society for the benefit of all, and not just to govern society for the benefit of just one group in particular, but rather to all people. So again, the world is really transforming with the introduction of new religious values that are really providing people a new model for human behavior. I mean, this started out, roughly speaking, around 700 BC, but this process of seeing the birth of new philosophical systems, new world religions, and so on, that are providing people new models for human behavior that are more centered on virtue and wisdom, is going to continue all the way to, roughly speaking, all the way to 700 AD. And this is going to be a time that gave us also new historical figures, such as, for example, Jesus, the founder of Christianity, and also Muhammad, which is going to be also the founder of Islam as well. They were part of this same process, again, trying to offer people a new ethic, a new law that is going to, once again, help them bring out the noble aspects, the noble nature of themselves, and trying to uplift, in many cases, also their state of mind, their state of being, and trying to create a whole new world, a whole new society, the ideal city or the ideal community again. So this is in very general terms what we're going to be looking at in this topic as we're going to be moving along part 1, part 2, and 3 by looking at the emergence of Christianity and Islam. Now, part 1, before we get into Christianity itself, it should be noted that both Christianity and Islam did not emerge in a vacuum. Those were not necessarily new religions, but rather those were new expressions of ideas that have been formed and developed for quite a while in the Mesopotamian world. Christianity and Islam emerged in Mesopotamia, so those are Mesopotamian religions. They emerge out of the Middle East, that is to say, okay? And they took on a lot of the elements that have been established in this region and created new expressions of them. Again, so in many cases, they reflect the Mesopotamian worldview, particularly the worldview that emanate from two main religious systems. One of them was Judaism. Again, both Christianity and Islam emerge out of Judaism. They're just new expressions of it. Both religions are deeply connected through the prophetic tradition of Judaism going back to Abraham. And Abraham, of course, is the patriarch of the Hebrew people that came out of the Mesopotamian world. We looked at that in the third topic of the semester. We looked at the ancient Hebrews. And Abraham lived about 2000 BC. This is, roughly speaking, again, this is the tentative date when Abraham was leading the Hebrews in southern Mesopotamia, as a matter of fact. And he established, so to speak, the lineage of prophets that both Jesus and Muhammad claimed to be part of. Okay, going back to the Abrahamic prophetic lineage tradition. In particular, what Christianity and Islam claim connections with back to Abraham is the idea of one God. Again, this idea of what is called monotheism. Judaism is considered one of the very first monotheistic faiths or religions in world history. Introducing the idea that there's only one God in the universe, in creation, and that people need to develop a total devotion, connection, and faith and loyalty to this only one God. And pretty much discarding beliefs in any other kinds of gods and spirits and deities, goddesses, etc., as either false or non-existent or etc. Okay? And Abraham was part of this process. He is the founder of monotheism. He's credited for having introduced monotheism in world history among the Hebrew people of ancient Mesopotamia. If you recall, we talked about how in the ancient world, the Hebrews followed a god because they were nomadic. Before they civilized, they were moving from place to place. They were pastoralists. They were herding sheep. And they moved from areas to areas and so on, moving along different trade routes along the Mesopotamian basin. And they, during this time, were polytheistic. They believed in spirits, they believed in different deities and so on, but they had one main god, their tribal god. It was called Yahweh. Okay, it was a sky god. Okay, and this was really consistent with the nomadic religions of the ancient world. Most nomadic groups of the ancient world had a sky god. They were guided by the sky, for their migrations. So Yahweh started out as a tribal god for the Hebrew people, and Abraham, as I explained earlier in the semester, had a personal connection, communion, and relationship with Yahweh. A kind of prophet of sorts. He was the mediator, spokesperson of Yahweh to his people. He was also the patriarch. He was the father figure of the Hebrews as well. Okay, that's very, very important to note as well. At some point, out of his communication with Yahweh, Abraham receives the message that Yahweh wishes to make a covenant with the Hebrew people. Again, this is the famous covenant with Abraham, Yahweh's covenant with Abraham. In this sacred pact or this sacred covenant, the idea was that the Hebrews were going to be given some land for them to settle and create a society or a civilization. Okay? A promised land, in other words. But in return, the Hebrews needed to remain loyal to Yahweh and discard all the other gods and spirits and only devote themselves to the worship of Yahweh. In other words, monotheism. Okay? Total faith and loyalty to one God. That was part of the covenant. Okay? So this started out, this tradition of monotheism. The covenant, in other words. So, the way that Abraham is going to be connected later on with both Christianity and Islam is that the descendants of Abraham are going to be the progenitors of Judaism on one hand, which really was the group in which Jesus was born into. Okay? So on one hand, again, we see one of the offsprings of Abraham, Isaac, to be the progenitor of Judaism. But on the other hand, Abraham also had another offspring as well, Ishmael, who is going to be the progenitor of Islam. So both Judaism, Christianity, and including Islam, all are connected in this long lineage, if you will, of generations and patriarchs that go back to Abraham. So Abraham is really the founder of Judaism, Christianity, and also of Islam as well. Okay? And those are the three religions, the three world religions that purport the idea of monotheism, again, of just one God. Okay? So first and foremost, keep that in mind. Again, how First and foremost, from Mesopotamia, we see the rise of monotheism through Abraham and Judaism. Okay. All right. So the other influence in Mesopotamia for the rise of Christianity in Islam is Zoroastrianism. So besides Judaism, Zoroastrianism also provided another very important influence in terms of not only monotheism, but as we'll see, the kind of central beliefs that both Christianity and Islam espouse. Now, Zoroastrianism is a religion that emerged in the ancient Persian Empire. The founder of Zoroastrianism was an individual by the name of Zoroaster or Zarathustra. Now, the exact date when he was actually born is not yet being confirmed. There are debates, of course, among scholars. He lived anywhere between the 9th century and the 6th century BC. Okay, so again, we don't know exactly the time when he lived. Okay, Zoroaster. The significance of Zoroaster for the emergence of Christianity in Islam is that Zoroaster also presents this monotheistic view of the world, just like Abraham. According to sources, people that actually have studied the Zoroastrian religion, this enlightened sage, Zoroaster, claimed to have had a vision, a mystical experience with the divine. In this vision, he was able to see a divine being that ruled over the entire universe. And it's just one being. And that one being was Ahura Mazda. Okay, so Ahura Mazda is the Zoroastrian version of Yahweh, of Judaism. Okay, this is just one God, again, of creation. Now, in his visions, Zoroaster or Zarathustra also claims to have seen that in the universe there is a force that opposes Ahura Mazda. And this force is an evil force. And Ahura Mazda did not really create it. So he doesn't really explain how this evil force comes about. He just says, well, that evil force has been present ever since the beginning of creation. It's been there all the time. And it represents evil. Its name is called Hanuman, in this case. And this is really what the devil is. You know, for later on, the Christians and the Muslims, of course, this is the version of the devil. And of course, in Judaism as well, you know, there is, you know, the presence of an entity, a force that opposes God. It's called Satan, for example, or the devil, and so on. And how the Hebrews and the Christians and the Muslims obtained that idea, they obtained that idea from Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism introduces the idea that in the world there's good and evil. You know, it's dualism, that there's dualism in the world. Okay? Ahura Mazda represents everything that is good, you know, peace, compassion, love, and care, etc. And Hanuman, in this case, represents evil. It's a wickedness and, you know, the spirit of the lie and deceit, jealousy and envy and rage and all the vices, in other words. Okay? So we get this, again, from Zoroastrianism. You know, in Mesopotamia, the idea that there's a God and there's a devil, of course, comes from Zoroastrianism. And all the religions that came out of Mesopotamia are going to adopt that view, this dualistic view. Number three, Zoroastrianism then proposes that the purpose of human existence is for people to follow the right way, what is called artha. The right way is right conduct, that we should follow the way of Ahura Mazda, of goodness, in other words, doing good to the world, being good to our neighbors, to all people. And trying to avoid, by all means, wickedness and deceit and jealousy and etc., anger, and lies and so on and so forth. Okay? And so he said it's not easy to do that because the way the evil force, Hariman, works is that it enters the thought patterns of people. Okay? It whispers in your mind, and it whispers lies, in other words. Lies that make people actually behave in a very destructive way. Okay? Deceits and lies and so on. It confuses people, it misguides people, it makes people actually angry and so on. So you create a conflict, if you will. So you have to be vigilant. According to Zoroastrianism, you have to be vigilant of your mind, of your thought patterns, and pretty much renounce and give up all kinds of negative thinking and follow the right way. Being kind to others, being compassionate and the like. Okay, it's called the right way. And this is all important according to Zoroaster because in the end, when people die, they're going to face either an afterlife that is going to be a place of reward, it's called a heaven, or a place of punishment. So again, this idea that there's going to be a heaven or hell is also introduced, again, very early on by Zoroastrianism as well. Okay, so this is important, okay, to behave properly, because otherwise we can actually go to this place of eternal punishment. So both Christianity and Islam are going to adopt those ideas as well. It also introduces the idea of the eschaton. The eschaton is the end times, that there is a divine plan for the end of the world in which God is going to separate the sheep from the wolves, if you will, and is going to judge the souls according to their actions as well. Again, this is something that was introduced way back before the birth of Christ as well. This idea of end times and judgment day, for example. All of those ideas were written down and they were compiled in a book, the holy book of Zoroastrianism called Saint Avesta. So again, this idea of having a holy book as well, or a Bible, actually comes from Zoroastrianism as well. And this is something so characteristic, of course, of the world religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as well, having a holy book as well. Now, Zoroastrianism is not going to be just a religion on the periphery of the Persian Empire. It will be adopted by the Persian Empire as the official religion of the state, and Ahura Mazda becomes the supreme being of the Persian Empire. So it is from this context that we're going to see the rise of Christianity. So this is extremely important, how Christianity is emerging in Mesopotamia, in the Eastern Mediterranean, if you will, but is going to take on many of the characteristics of the Mesopotamian worldview, particularly Judaism. It has a direct lineage connection back to Abraham, for example, this idea of monotheism, but also with Zoroastrianism as well, this idea of one God, but also having, of course, an opposing force, the devil or Satan, trying to compete for winning souls, either for heaven or punishment, and the idea of Judgment Day as well, okay, in the end times, the eschaton as it is called. So let's look now in part 2 at the rise of Christianity, how Christianity emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean from a Jewish sect to become really an imperial religion. And it started out with, of course, the founder of this religion, with Jesus, okay, the figure of Jesus Christ. Okay, that was born in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Middle East. We're talking about Judah in this case, and how he's going to, through his teachings, is going to create a religious movement, or a spiritual movement, otherwise known as Christianity. And slowly but surely, as we'll see, this religious or spiritual movement is going to transform itself into a more organized religion, eventually becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. Okay, so let's look at the background of Jesus and Christianity. So, to understand the background of Jesus and Christianity, we have to start with, first and foremost, the notion that Christianity, as it was offered, founded by Jesus, it was a religion that offered salvation. Very consistent what we talked about, just a moment ago. The idea of salvation that Zarathustra or Zoroaster talked about, that through right living, the right way, that people can attain salvation and go to heaven, for example. Well, Christianity took on a lot of the ideas of Zoroastrianism, but most importantly, Christianity also obtained a great deal of characteristics from the religions of salvation, particularly from Egypt. Okay? The Egyptian religion during the time of Jesus was still a religion of salvation, and it had been a religion of salvation for thousands of years. We looked at that in the second topic of the semester. When you look at Egyptian mythology, for example, in Egyptian religions, we have, for example, saviors, for example. In this case, we're talking about Isis, for example. Isis was really the goddess that resurrected Osiris when he was killed by his brother Set. Okay? So those were actually gods that came to earth to establish the very first kingdom of Egypt. And while they were here, they suffered, of course, confrontations with the evil figure of Set. He represented wickedness as well, the evil force, if you will, of creation. And Seth killed Osiris, so Osiris died. But Isis, through her powers and magic, was able to resurrect Osiris from the dead. So this idea of resurrection was established very early on by the ancient Egyptians. This idea of a god, a divine figure that comes into the world in order to save it, that is put to death by an evil force, and then is resurrected from the death by the third day, and so on. It comes from Egypt. Okay, this idea of resurrection. And after the resurrection of Osiris by his wife Isis, she's really saving the world by resurrecting Osiris. Osiris then moves into the ethers, into this spirit world, and in the spirit world, he is now in the gates of heaven, and he's going to be judging the souls of the dead, whether they're going to be good, to be given access to heaven, or to go into this place of punishment as well. So what we see is a cult in ancient Egypt is devoted to Isis. She is the savior, of course, but it's also a cult devoted to the god of Osiris as well, the god of the afterlife. He is at the gates of heaven, the field of reeds. This is, a place of abundance and joy, where people that were actually good in their lives were going to enjoy a very peaceful and blissful existence in the afterlife. So Jesus is going to be born in a time when this cult, the savior cult of Isis and Osiris, was dominant in the Eastern Mediterranean. Not only in Egypt, but in the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole, there were devotees of Isis and Osiris, and this idea of death, resurrection, and salvation was dominant, again, during this time. So let us just, first and foremost, understand that Christianity is coming out of this background. Now, the other influence or background of Christianity in Jesus is the prophetic tradition of Judaism. As I mentioned, going back to Abraham, the very first Hebrew prophet that introduces monotheism among the Hebrews, and at the same time introduced monotheism in the world as well. Okay? Now, in the history of the Hebrews, we see, of course, a tradition of prophets. Those are the representatives of the Hebrew people before their God, Yahweh, and he's going to serve as a spokesperson for messages or new dispensations, new laws, and so on to be given to the Hebrew people. In this case, we're talking about, for example, Moses, who came much, much later than Abraham, around 1200 BC, and he is the liberator, on one hand, of the Hebrews that were enslaved in Egypt. But at the same time, once the Hebrews were liberated from Egypt, Moses also is given the 10 Commandments by Yahweh, the law of Moses. Again, a new religious ethical code, 10 laws that are divine. They were given by the divine to the Hebrews so they can follow and, of course, create a civilized society. It's a new law, okay? It's a new law for ethics, for righteous living, for moral virtue, and so on, okay? The laws of Moses. So this is the second prophet, so to speak, of the Hebrews that are connected to subsequent prophets that end up with Jesus ultimately, again, according to the Christian teachings, again, to the Christian faith. We also saw, for example, other prophets after Moses. Once the Hebrews are settled and they're creating their unified kingdom, a monarchy, and civilization, we see the rise of a number of prophets like Samuel, Isaiah, Elijah, and others, Ezekiel, and so on. There's a great many of them, of course. And if you remember, the purpose of the prophets, there was a certain function that they played, besides, of course, serving as spokespersons for Yahweh to the Hebrews. Their purpose was to maintain the covenant with Abraham of, monotheism, making sure that the Hebrews renounced to the devotion and worship of foreign gods and so on. There was a multiplicity, of course, of different creeds among the Jews, among the Hebrews, that were borrowed from their neighbors and other societies. And of course, the prophets were insisting that the Hebrews will just give them up, of course, and instead be loyal to Yahweh. But at the same time, the prophets were not only trying to enforce monotheism, but were also at the same time social critics. Those were critics of society that favored, in many cases, the poor, the oppressed, okay? And they were calling people's attention, whenever there were, for example, people owning slaves, for example. So they were critical of slavery, for example. Okay, they were critical of people building great fortunes and great wealth as well. And they were very critical. Again, so social justice was also part of the prophetic tradition and the prophetic message. Social justice, favoring the oppressed, favoring the marginalized, the poor, and criticizing those that were oppressing and so on, the wealthy and the like. This is another fundamental component of the prophetic tradition of the ancient Hebrews. And along with that, the prophets also announce, in many cases, the coming of a Messiah as well. Like Isaiah, the books of Isaiah in the Old Testament also announce, a prophecy for the birth of a Messiah. And Christians claim, of course, that prophecy dealt with the birth of Jesus. Again, the birth of a Messiah that was going to be born in a specific time to give a new dispensation, a new law, if you will, to the Hebrews and the like. So the prophetic tradition was key, instrumental for the rise of Christianity. Now, in the year 63 BC, this region where the Hebrews live, Judea, or Judah in this case, was conquered by the Romans, and it was incorporated into the Roman Empire. It becomes a new province of the Roman Empire, okay, a Roman province. And it will remain so all the way to the year 634 AD, okay? And why this is important is because when Jesus was born in this region was already governed by the Romans, again, and the Romans sent governors. Initially, Herodes, again, was one of them, and later on, he was succeeded by Pontius Pilate. Again, those were two Roman governors, again, that ruled over this region. Now, it is in this context that Jesus was born. He was born in a very important time of significant change because on one hand, one of the changes that was transpiring during this time was the Roman Empire itself. Okay, we looked at that, in the past topic, the birth of the Roman Empire, how the Roman Republic come to an end with Julius Caesar, and then his successor, Octavius Augustus, and we see the transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire, conquering, also this portion of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the second, of course, is that this portion of the Mediterranean, Judah, is also now conquered by the Romans as well. So Jesus is born in this time, and when we look at his life and teachings, it is very important to note that most of the information that comes to us about the life and the teachings of Jesus do not come from him directly, but rather from his own disciples and apostles. Okay, the writings of the apostles that in the New Testament will be known as the Gospels. Again, particularly, we're looking at Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke. They're going to be the main, of course, apostles that are going to be writing about Jesus. Now, of course, scholars today, through studies of linguistics and so on, determine that the Gospels were written about 80 years after the death of Jesus. So the author of Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, according to scholars, were perhaps people that received that information from the apostles themselves, but those were people that lived much, much later than the apostles. This is something that scholars actually debate about. But nonetheless, what we learn from the Gospels is that, Jesus was born during this time, and more or less at the age of 9 or 10, thereabouts, he disappears from sight. We just don't know much from those writings about Jesus. Let it just say from age 10 all the way to the age 30. We don't know, what happened during those so-called lost years of Jesus. He returns to the scene around age 30, and he's now preaching again in this region of the fringes of the Roman Empire, and he's preaching a whole new message. He claims to be connected to this prophetic tradition In other words, a Messiah or prophet that is connected to this lineage of prophets going back to Moses and Abraham altogether, and that he is presenting a whole new teaching, a new revelation, new religious values. In this case, as we'll see, not only to be given to the Hebrews, but to humanity as a whole. Again, and what we learn from the writings of the apostles is that once he started preaching, he's going to provide one of his main seminal messages in what is called the Sermon of the Mount. Okay, the Sermon of the Mount, this is a time when Jesus had already gone through a series of tests and trials, having gone to the desert to face temptations and the like. And after those challenges and trials and so on, he's now returning back to the scene to impart on new teachings. And the new teaching, once again, is a new covenant. In this case, a covenant not with one specific group. What Jesus is actually announcing is that he has a covenant now with humanity. In other words, that the message is to be given to the world, not just to a group of people, but rather that his message is universal. And the central core of his teaching is that all humans are equal. Okay, this idea of universal equality. Once again, this idea of tribal groups or ethnic groups, linguistic groups, to being separated from one another, worshiping different gods and so on. Jesus is offering, again, a whole new revelation in which he's trying to bring people together under the same faith, if you will, the same message. This idea that all people are actually equal in the eyes of God. We're all brothers and sisters, so to speak. We're all sons and daughters of God. So we're all equal, in other words. So there are really no distinctions. This is a message of universal love and compassion, selflessness, forgiveness, turn the other cheek when you're offended and so on. Forgive your enemies, pray for them and so on. Care for the poor and the oppressed. This is very consistent, again, with the message of the prophets that I just mentioned. This idea of social justice, in other words, caring for the poor and the oppressed. And so this is a message of love and compassion, selflessness, forgiveness, and so on, and charity, and so on, again. And is for everybody. It's not just for one group of people, but rather for all humans. Okay? Another central aspect of the Christian teachings is the idea of salvation. Again, this is very consistent with what we have been discussing, with the Egyptian religion of Isis and Osiris, for example. His life experience was one in which, because of his message being so radical, the Romans felt threatened by it, and they decided to crush, if you will, his message. The Romans believed that Jesus was inciting the masses and so on. He was seditious, in other words, against the Roman state. And he's going to be persecuted by the Romans, and he's going to be tried under Roman laws and courts, and he's going to be sentenced to death by crucifixion. Now, according to the Gospels, just like Osiris, even though he died, by the third day, he is resurrected. Again, so this is consistent, again, with the Savior religions that we just discussed as well. The idea or the central message of Christianity is that death is really an illusion. Okay? That the body might die, but that the soul or the spirit is eternal. It survives death, in other words. So it talks about the eternal soul, the immortality of the spirit, in this case, that transcends death. Okay? So because the spirit transcends death, then it is important for the spirit to attain immortality. It is immoral, but it's important to attain what is called salvation, to avoid, if you will, dying without actually realizing the immortality of the soul or immortality of the spirit. So there's the idea of salvation, of this other world, a paradise, a heaven in which the spirit will be living eternally, forever, okay, in perfect bliss, if you will, okay, transcending death, transcending suffering, if you will. So how do we then attain salvation? How do we then save our souls and go to this eternal paradise? Well, the message of Christ was one in which, very consistent with Buddhism, for example, the idea of self-denial. In other words, you have to renounce to the temptations and the trappings of the world, particularly rejecting wealth and power. You know, one of the temptations that he faced in the desert, of course, were the temptations of wealth and power. He was offered, the riches and the kingdoms and all the power in the world, and he had to, confront that, of course, temptation. It's a trapping. It keeps souls trapped, imprisoned in the world of illusion, if you will. Okay? So, again, self-denial, denying oneself to the trappings of the world, particularly wealth and power. So, this is very consistent with, again, the prophetic tradition of the Hebrews as well. There's another, of course, aspect of the Christian message, in that is the eschaton. This is something we discuss about Zoroastrianism. This idea of end times. The writings of the apostles talks about a second coming of Christ, that Christ is going to return once again in a future time, and there will be a great battle in the world between the forces of goodness and the forces of darkness. Very consistent with what Zoroaster talked about, this duality, again, the forces of goodness, the light and darkness. And there will be, again, a separation of the sheep and the wolves. Again, it's called Judgment Day. And that Christ is going to institute a millennial or ideal utopian Christian kingdom on earth, renewing the world, creating a new humanity, and it will last for 1,000 years again. That is more of a prophetic vision of the Christian message. And of course, this was a message that was cherished and kept by a group of disciples, and those disciples disseminated those ideas to others and so on. But it was just a Jewish sect. Christianity was nothing other than just a group of supporters and followers and apostles of Jesus that after his death kept those ideas and messages. Some of them were written down, some of them were passed down in oral forms and so on from place to place. But the key figure that is going to be responsible for spreading Christianity across the Roman Empire was the Apostle Paul. Okay, so the Apostle Paul was critical in spreading Christianity far and wide, so converting or transforming Christianity from a Jewish sect to a religion that encompassed, again, the vast imperial system of Rome. He was a Greek who had been given citizenship by Rome, so he was a Roman citizen, but he was also a Jew. So the significance of this is that he's coming from very diverse backgrounds, a very cosmopolitan background in which he endorses or absorbs Greek culture, Roman culture as well, but also the Jewish tradition at the same time. And the Apostle Paul initially served the Roman state in fighting this Christian sect. The Romans were very suspicious of the Christians, considered them as rabble rousers in many cases, and they were persecuted. And the Apostle Paul started out his career in this way, persecuting the Christians, fighting this Christian sect. But at some point, the Apostle Paul talks about his conversion experience as he's moving to Damascus, in the road to Damascus, as it is called. He had an encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, and this revelation completely transformed his life, and he becomes now a Christian with a mission. This mystical experience, this mystical encounter with Jesus is going to bring him to the forefront of this missionary work of trying to convert, first and foremost, the Jewish population living in the Greek cities. So he's preaching to a Greek, first and foremost, in the Greek cities to a Jewish audience, believing that, well, they're going to be, of course, the most obvious listeners of this message, just because, Jesus comes from this lineage, of course. But later on, the Apostle Paul becomes convinced that it was necessary to spread this message among the Gentiles, that it was not just a message that was intended for the Jews, because this was a universal message for all humanity. So he's going to now deliver the Christian message to all peoples, regardless of backgrounds, even, again, different linguistic groups. And he's going to be preaching, particularly in coastal regions, in the international ports. He's going to be preaching in the main cities, particularly, again, in urban areas. And at some point, he's going to go into the Western Mediterranean and preach in the very heart of the Roman Empire, in the city of Rome as well. Again, you can see in this map the journeys that the Apostle Paul undertook in his missionary work as he's moving from place to place, again, preaching the Christian message and trying to convert populations to Christianity and establish the very first Christian churches. Again, the very first Christian churches were established by Paul as well. Again, the very first Christian churches. Okay? So, in this process of establishing the very first Christian churches, the Apostle Paul is going to write letters to the people in charge of those churches. Okay? He's going to maintain communication with them in order to clarify theological principles, and they're going to become the writings of the Apostle Paul as the epistles. They're going to become part of the New Testament, so to speak. And those were Paul's writings, again, to the leaders of the congregations of the churches that he actually established and founded. And one of those key principles was, number one, and this is fundamental to understanding pretty much Christianity as it was founded, not necessarily by Jesus, but now by the apostles. And as the idea that Jesus was not just an ordinary prophet, but rather that he was indeed the Son of God, in other words. So it is really the Apostle Paul that introduces this notion as Jesus as the Son of God, or stresses that idea very clearly. The idea that in order to attain salvation, people need to accept Jesus as the Son of God and as a Savior, okay, and maintain, of course, total faith in communion with Jesus as well. Again, and by receiving the grace of God and the grace of Jesus, this is the way that souls attain salvation after death in the afterlife. Okay? He also clarifies that Christianity, although it's connected back to Moses in this tradition of prophets, that is separate from Mosaic law, from the law of Moses, in other words. This is not to say that Christianity is rejecting the law of Moses, it's really advancing it in so many cases, but it's really creating a more universal message, including all humanity in this process. Okay? It doesn't necessarily stick with the protocols, with the rules, with the prescriptions of Moses necessary, the dietary laws, for example, and so on, all those customs that were established by Moses, that those were not necessary, that it was just necessary to accept Jesus and follow Jesus, in other words, okay? And, follow the prescriptions of this new revelation, this religion of love, compassion, kindness, and so on. So again, hope is really the central message of Christianity according to Paul. What is really hope for the Apostle Paul? The hope for resurrection, salvation, and love. Those are key principles of Christianity according to Paul to create a whole new society, a new society that will replace the cruel and wicked power of Rome. So again, the Christians very early on, what we see, for example, with Paul, is a rejection in many cases of Roman values and Roman culture. Again, they want the introduction of a new society centered more on love, compassion, the idea of resurrection and salvation. Again. Now, also the Apostle Paul was concerned with issues of sexual morality as well, because very early on in the Christian churches, sexual misconduct, according to how we see it today, was not very well clarified during this time. This idea of monogamy, for example, stressing monogamy, faithfulness, and so on, loyalty, and so on, chastity, and the like. Again, he's going to introduce those values as well as central to Christian ethics. This is the way a Christian should behave as well. So Paul is clarifying those issues. And as a whole, the writings of the apostles, whether we're talking about Luke and Mark and Matthew and John, for example, and the writings of the epistles by Paul, all together, all of those writings will constitute now a New Testament. Again, this is the new revelation, the new teaching, again, of Christianity that is intended for humanity, not just for one group of people. Okay? So, unfortunately, we ran out of time. This is the end of this discussion. When we come back, we're going to continue looking at Christianity, how it was challenging the Roman Empire, how the Roman Empire persecuted the Christians, but ultimately, at some point, the Romans incorporated Christianity as the official religion of the state, and then we're going to be moving into part 3, really looking at the rise of Islam, okay, when we come back in session 2. This is all I have for you, and I'll see you in session 2. Thank you.